and editor of the Densho Encyclopedia. So as people start to enter, I'll just give you some brief background of the program. Also should mention that it is going to be recorded, just for your information. And I think Sarah Beckman, who's running the program from behind the scenes, will start recording in just a moment. But anyway, the program, the origin of the program, it comes from a grant we received from the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program last year, 2019, to produce 65 new articles for the Densho Encyclopedia. These are articles that would have a California focus, given the funder. We assembled a 5-person advisory committee that included Valerie Matsumoto, the professor of Asian American Studies and History at UCLA, and the George and Sakai Aratani Chair on the Japanese American Incarceration, Redress, and Community, Ben Kobashigawa, Professor Emeritus in Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, and the late Lane Ryo Hirabayashi, who is Valerie's predecessor as the Aratani Chair at UCLA, and whom I'll talk a little bit more about a little later. And the other two on the advisory committee were Kristen and Patricia, who were part of this program, and I'll introduce them shortly. So with the help of this group, we came up with a long list of headwords out of which we produced, wrote, and put online 65 new articles by a dozen different authors. Actually, I should mention that not all of them are online yet. Most of them are, but some are not. They'll all be up by the end of the year, which is like in 3 weeks. And we thought that many of the topics that people wrote about are ones that are, not that well known, even among those of us interested in Japanese American studies. So we thought it would be good to have a program featuring some of the authors and highlighting some of the things they wrote about, some of the stories. And that's the purpose of this program. So we're going to just do it kind of informally in conversation with the different, with three of the authors, contributors to the encyclopedia. As we go along, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. There's a tab down below where you can go ahead and add your questions as we go along. And at the end, we'll have some time to address as many of the questions as we can. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists today, all of whom are young scholars, young being described as younger than me, which, okay, maybe that's not so young. But they also have in common that all of them have at least one foot in the public history arena as well. So in alphabetical order, starting with Jonathan Van Harmelen, who comes to us from Templeton, California. He's currently a PhD student in history at UC Santa Cruz, specializing in the history of Japanese American incarceration. He holds a BA in history and French from Pomona College and has completed an MA from Georgetown University. From 2015 to 18, he worked for the National Museum of American History, part of the Smithsonian, as an intern and researcher. And if you've read much of the vernacular press, you've probably seen his work in Discover Nikkei, the Nichibei Times, Rafu Shimpo. For those of us who've been around a while, it's exciting to have new people coming into the field. So we have high hopes for Jonathan in the years to come. Next is Kristen Hayashi. She's the Director of Collections Management and Access and a curator at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. She comes to us from Pasadena, California. She is a public historian with experience ranging from being part of the curatorial team for Becoming Los Angeles, a semi-permanent exhibition at the National Museum of Los Angeles County, to being on the boards of directors of the Little Tokyo Historical Society and Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. She holds PhD and MA degrees from the University of California, Riverside, and a BA from Occidental College. Her dissertation research examined what it took for Japanese Americans to restart their lives following the return to post-World War II Los Angeles from America's concentration camps, which is also a subject I'm really interested in. And it's something she'll talk about a little later in some of the things she wrote for the encyclopedia. And finally, our final panelist is Patricia Mie Wakita, who is an artist, writer, and community historian who's worked with numerous institutions such as the Japanese American National Museum, the Oakland Museum of California, the National Japanese American Historical Society, Topaz Museum, Discover Nikkei, Heyday Books, and serves on numerous nonprofit boards. She was the editor of 2 publications on the Japanese American experience, Only What We Could Carry, the Japanese American Internment Experience, and Unfinished Message, the collected works of Chiye Mori. She's a yonsei whose parents were incarcerated as children at Jerome and Gila concentration camps. Patricia's authored many of the articles on writers and artists in the encyclopedia, and as a writer and artist herself, she's really brought some special insight to them. And she'll be talking about, well, one in particular, a piece that she did for as part of the new editions. So what we're going to do is just talk about the articles in 3 broad categories. First, topics that have to do directly with the wartime incarceration, then about some of the interesting biographical articles, and then finally articles focusing on the post-camp period and the legacy of incarceration. So starting with the topics that have to do directly with the wartime incarceration, I wanted to start with Jonathan, because as it happens, I think almost all of the pieces he did focus on stuff on confinement sites or things that were happening right in those sites. And I wanted to spend most of the time, Jonathan, talking about your WWII, which you just taught me how to pronounce correctly, project at Manzanar. But also you did a number of others as well. So can you tell us about some of those that you did for us?
Absolutely. Give me 1 second. So I wanted to, well, first, thank you so much, Brian, for the introduction. And thank you to the folks at Densho for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be speaking here. As someone who's used throughout a lot of my academic work, the resources at Densho, this is it's a not just profound, but it's a really great experience to be able to contribute to Densho's work. To pick up on what Brian was saying, most of the articles I've written focus on the wartime years and parts of the incarceration experience. One thing I wanted to address in particular is kind of a theme with some of the articles, not with all of them that I wrote, but in particular this thought of the connections between the incarceration, the camps, and a lot of the West Coast, especially California, even after exclusion and incarceration. That even with the exclusion zone put up by the Western Defense Command and mass removal incarceration, that there were still these overlaps between the West Coast communities and the camps themselves. And so I've been particularly interested in how whether they're individuals, public institutions, or political groups, how they interacted with the camps. And some of these have been themes that have been addressed by previous scholars, but I think I'm picking up on this particular thread helps to rethink some parts of the incarceration experience, and also the relationship of the camps to the United States and U.S. history as a whole, I think, and how it was not simply just something that a lot of Americans were unaware of, I believe. So the first picture you see here is a picture of the Tenney Committee. So 2 of the articles that I wrote were focused on California State's legislature committees. One being the Tenney Committee, which was a joint committee between the California State Assembly and the California State Senate. The other one, which I'll talk in briefly, is the Gannon Committee, which was a specific committee for just the California State Assembly. So these 2 committees, there's a third one which hasn't been written yet, is the Donnelly Committee for the California State Senate. These different committees both were tasked with investigating the camps and continuing a lot of the racial rhetoric that was already being spread by the Hearst press and a lot of other media outlets about questions of these myths of disloyalty without any proof, of issues of questions of espionage, and even of potential violence that was being created within the camps, in particular with cases such as Tule Lake. The Tenney Committee actually predates the war years. It starts in January 41 and is created as a mini DICE committee. For those that don't know, the DICE Committee was the name of the House Un-American Activities Committee in Washington that was led by Congressman Martin Dice of Texas. So this similar committee was created in California to investigate un-American activities, specifically Axis activity in California, but was very much targeted at the Japanese American community in trying to investigate these myths of subservient activity or so-called disloyalty. And the Tenney Committee spent most of its time going through and investigating the individual camps, especially exacerbating a lot of the myths that were being promoted by the Hearst Press about Tule Lake, for example. They would send representatives, one of the Tenney Committee and another that was of the American Legion, as we of course know is one of the perhaps the hate groups of the period that were known for other incidents such as the Hood River erasure of Japanese American veterans, and kind of legitimized at the state political level the incarceration, and also in promoting this ongoing movement to keep Japanese Americans out, which of course ends with Ex parte Endo and of course the ending of the exclusion zone in January 45. But one point I want to address with the Tenney Committee as well is that the committee exists from 41 to 49. And one of these continuities with the committee is even after they stop investigating issues or so-called issues with Japanese Americans is their use of similar rhetoric in communist purges during the McCarthyist era. So one example of this is in the late 40s, the Tenney Committee pushes for a loyalty oath to be given to employees of the University of California system. So very much similar to what you see with the questions 27 and 28 of the loyalty oath given to Japanese Americans in 43. A similar loyalty oath was created for employees of the state of California. Briefly, the Gannon Committee, as I said before, was for the California State Assembly and was specifically only created for dealing with the so-called issues of Japanese Americans in the camps, and did investigations throughout the West Coast, specifically related to the potential of resettlement of Japanese Americans, and intentionally promoted the idea of not allowing Japanese Americans to come back. They also intentionally attacked groups that were allies of the Japanese American community, such as the Pacific Coast Fair Play Committee, and academics such as Sproul of UC Berkeley and Robert Millikan of Caltech, or the California Institute of Technology. So briefly, this is one of the political institutions that even after Executive Order 9066 and the incarceration, you still have political groups in California actively trying to keep Japanese Americans out. So next I want to talk about the Waiuli Project. In particular, I want to talk about this relationship. I'll start, since this photo, I'll start with this one real quick. This is actually of the LA County, of the LA Police and its relationship with incarceration. So before I get to Waiuli, I'll briefly talk about the role of the LAPD and of course the LA County Jail in the incarceration. So initially, right after Pearl Harbor, the FBI and the LAPD worked together in rounding up Japanese American community leaders, a number of the Issei leaders, and Buddhists and Shinto, the Buddhist priests in particular, and they used the LA County Jail as a site of confinement, as a in-between point before a number of the Issei were sent to places like Fort Missoula or Santa Fe at the larger INS internment camps. So what I wanted to highlight with this article in particular is not just the WRA incarceration system and also the camps that were created by the Department of Justice and the immigration system and the immigration naturalization services, but also how local law enforcement in particular worked with the incarceration as well, and how we have these smaller sites of shame being one of the projects Brian works on, as part of kind of this broader history of how we understand confinement incarceration. And part of also, I think it asks these other questions related to what we think of the carceral state today in places like California. So briefly, that's the article on the LA County Jail. There's one also on the Whitcomb Hotel as well that highlights this as part of this story. So for the Waiuli Project, I want to briefly talk about its relationship with universities. This is an illustration that was done by Kengo Takamura and Manzanar of Frank Hirasawa. Frank Hirasawa was a chemist that worked on the Waiuli Project. And what I want to highlight is that the individuals that worked on the Waiuli Project were, they came from various backgrounds, but a lot of them actually had strong academic backgrounds. Some had PhDs already from distinguished institutions such as UC Berkeley and Stanford. One of the leaders, Shinpei Nishimura, was a PhD student of Robert Emerson, who was one of the academic advisors of the project, and was a PhD student at Caltech. And what I want to distinguish this project from other projects such as the camouflage net factories is that the Waiuli project was engaging in what I would call a form of scientific patriotism that was unique specifically to the Waiuli project and produced not just a material object of Waiuli rubber products like spatulas, but also provided this academic knowledge that still can be used and is still being used to this day, actually, of how we think about the Waiuli plant and crossbreeding, and is what resulted out of the Waiuli project were 3 publications in various academic journals such as Science and Botany. And so what the Waiuli project wanted to do was create a sustainable form of rubber based on the Waiuli plant, which is a desert shrub. You can still go to the Manzanar historic site to this day and find the shrub on the grounds, which is part of this living legacy of the project in the tangible form in the history of the camp. But in particular, the Waiuli project not only was this sort of academic project going on in the camps, but had a direct relationship with Caltech, which was sponsoring the project, and a number of financial institutions. The Earhart Foundation sent a grant to the Waiuli project as well, because the WWII did not want to provide any financial backing. And the Emergency Rubber Project, which was sponsoring other Waiuli projects in the state of California, did not want to sponsor the Waiuli project as well, because it was with the Department of Agriculture, whereas the camps were with the Department of Interior. And so what I want to highlight, especially as well with the Waiuli project, is both the continuities of the project being able to produce this form of knowledge production, or producing academic knowledge, and also having this knowledge that's being used to this day to bring into the present. I was finding in some of the research that Wiley had taken up more interest in recent years as a sustainable form of rubber. And I found I apologize, there's a timer, but ways in which the Waiuli project was being used, like companies like Patagonia have cited this form of rubber for its own products. So I'll just end on that, and yeah. Brian, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted apparently. With regard to the Waiuli project, did you want to mention your forthcoming article on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm having an article that comes out with Southern California Quarterly, which examines this broader history of the Waiuli project in more detail than the encyclopedia article, which discusses the relationships of, for example, with Caltech, and discusses the concept of scientific patriotism as in framing the Waiuli project is different from other academic projects such as the JRS project, for example. So the form of collaboration that was going on between the different scientists that were working in Manzanar, and of course academics such as Emerson and Robert Millikan that helped sponsor the project. So yes, forthcoming this coming year. So
yeah, great. Yeah, I mean it's a subject I think a lot of people have heard of, but it's interesting that no one's really written an academic piece about that. Or there was one that was more in a scientific type journal, but from a historian's point of view, it's great that you're doing this. So anyway, okay, so actually, if Sarah, if you could skip over the next slide, because I'm going to just I won't talk about this, and we'll move on now to some of the biographical articles, and we're going to start actually with Patricia here, who ended up going on kind of a research odyssey on a particular former incarceree. In introducing Patricia, I didn't mention that she's, I don't think, coming to us from Oakland. So, but yeah, if Patricia, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thanks so much, Brian. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. So I decided to just focus on one person that I wrote an article about for this recent round of articles. And this one does focus on a California named Chiye Mori. She was a poet and journalist and a central figure in the formation of a pretty serious Nisei literary coterie in pre-war Los Angeles. But one of the things that I do love about her was that she was an editor as well, and she held several pretty powerful editorial positions on the East Coast and West Coast Japanese American publications, including the Manzanar Free Press newspaper at some point. So I'll start by saying too that whenever I do research for Densho, I almost always try to find a birth date and a death date and try to establish that. Mori left an extremely complicated paper trail. She was married 3 times. Her mother married at least twice. And that meant that names changed constantly during the search, which made this really tough. And I had to call upon a lot of my historian friends and cultural experts to help me put together the pieces of her story. So I usually start with an obituary if I can find one. There was no obituary that I was able to find online on Chiye Mori, but by going through the website ancestry.com, which is one of my first go-tos, or familysearch.com, I found this US Social Security Applications and Claims Index that gave me a birth date, a birthplace, her mother and father's name, and a death date. So that actually really helped me move things forward. I also later learned that Mori's birthday was also listed in the Asian American Literature Bibliography by Kim Kok Chung and Stan Yogi. So as you can see, she was born to Sakyo and Yoritaro Mori on February 1st in Oregon. But next slide, by 1930, her mother had actually remarried to a man named Jujiro Suzuki. And I know this is a little tough to read, you guys, but this is a census from 1930 in Long Beach. And if you look at the very top, it says Suzuki Jugiro, daughter. So it doesn't even include her name, just daughter. And then below that, this was actually the page before this one, Suzuki Jugiro and Sakyo. And then it tells you, if you've never looked at a census form before, like the relationship to each other and what sex, where they're from. And it kind of started to, I was putting it together and realizing, yes, actually this Suzuki person is her stepfather and her mother remarried and her hiding in this census form. So again, we see here that by this time they were in Long Beach, California, which is actually where she ended up finishing school. She went to Long Beach Polytechnical High School, and she graduated there with a lot of other Nisei at that time period, including the writer, Nisei writer Larry Tajiri. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing is that early on, she's starting to show really strong literary and artistic talents. She and Larry Tajiri both were writing for their local newspaper at school, but Larry was also doing the editorial work for one of the Japanese newspapers in the area. And he brought her on to write both, a column on literary types of things and poetry. And the funny thing is that this newspaper called the Kashimai Nichi, she put her name often under other pen names as well. So here we see the emblems column under Chiye Mori, but the next slide, you can see that she's publishing under the name Loretta C. Mori. So and the poem to the left of the 4 poems is also by Loretta C. Mori. She started these columns in the early 30s. I think the first one was starting maybe in 32, and then the Emblem Poetics was starting around 33. I was able to uncover these pieces and find out what her pen name was thanks to Valerie Matsumoto and her incredible research on early literary writers. So she also, in addition to doing the writing, was contributing pen illustrations. I don't think this drawing here is hers, but I can't actually be sure. But I read from Valerie Matsumoto's scholarship that she also was contributing illustrations to the Kashimai Nichi newspaper as well, which is pretty exciting. Next slide, please. So again, that's 33, 32. In 1933, following a courtship fed by an exchange of poems, and I can just imagine the timbre of these poems. In 1933 March, she married Issei writer Bunichi Kagawa and moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where he lived. He's obviously a very dashing, kind of a younger Issei looking to me, I'm not sure. And I love this photo that I was able to find online of some of the publications that still exist of his. They're really classy, gorgeous looking chapbooks of his poetry. But sadly, the marriage did not last very long. And by 1934, the following year, she had actually left and moved back to Los Angeles. Next slide, please. According to an article by Nisei writer Mary Oyama in October 1934, Mori and 10 other writers gathered for dinner to discuss the formation of a Nisei literary organization and they later called themselves the Nisei Writers Group. So it sounded like, I think they were gathering in people's homes and living rooms occasionally and discussing the writings and showing each other work. And this kind of started culminating into a literary magazine they called Leaves that featured their output. And it was overseen by an editorial board of Mary Oyama, Yasuo Sasaki, Kara Kondo, and Chiye Mori. The magazine was actually on a subscription base and mimeographed, hand-bound, and distributed to people. The really challenging thing I want to say as an aside is that amongst my supportive group of friends that have been helping me put this article together, it's pretty rare to find a copy of this Leaves magazine. In fact, my friend Greg Robinson, next slide please, is the only person that I know that has actually seen a copy of it. And he found this in the UCLA Library Special Collections, Ichiyoko collection, but it was actually tucked into a file for another magazine. So I am unclear personally if there were many, like how many different issues there were and exactly when they came out. I put circa 1940, but it could be earlier. According to the notes that I got from Greg, he actually also traced to a column by Larry Tajida talking about this particular issue that we think is an issue of Leaves, and matched it to the contributors. And it also said that there was a dynamic cover by Hideo Date. So we're kind of guessing, we're pretty sure that this is a copy of Leaves magazine. But anyway, this is an aside. We are looking for Leaves magazines in general, if people ever come across them. Next slide, please. In 1938, then Mori married another person. This was the writer and actor Edward Kamiyama. His alias was Edo Mita. So as an actor, I believe he used the stage name Edo Mita. And according to an interview with Mary Nishi Ishizuka by Valerie Matsumoto again, in addition to writing at this time period, Mori also supported herself as a cosmetics demonstrator to Nisei women. As the politics around this time, again, this is 1938, were heating up, she became more and more involved in some of the political groups in the area, including the Liberal Democratic Club, which was also known as the Nisei Young Democrats. In 1942, with the passing of Executive Order 9066, of course, Mori went to camp. Edo Mita was actually ill with tuberculosis, and instead of going immediately to camps, he was sent to the Hillcrest Sanatorium to recuperate. So Mori went to camp with her mother and stepfather to Manzanar. So I think the next slide is, I'll just explain the story. That she was actually registered under the name Chiye Mita, but under her stepfather and mother's name. So in order for me to find her in the Manzanar registers to see that she had entered Manzanar, I had to look under Suzuki, and then below it, it said Chiye Mita under that household, which is very unusual and again, very sneaky. It took a lot of work to piece this one together. So the Manzanar Free Press was the concentration camp's bi-weekly newspaper, which later grew to a tri-weekly publication, and it debuted in April 11th of 1942. By July 22nd in the 1942 issue, Chiye was listed as editor of the paper. So let's go to the next slide, please. And we'll see a masthead where if you look to the left, the very top thing is the editorial staff is Chiye Mori. It's a little misleading, I should say, that for the lifetime of the Free Press, as with a lot of the papers, that editorialship seat was revolving constantly, and people were always leaving or switching, or sometimes in just a regular press time, they would rotate every few, every other issue would be a different editor. But I think at this point, Chiye took the reins for a solid section of time as the editor and kind of guided the content, of course, with the understanding that there was still a lot of scrutiny and censorship that was being kind of imposed upon the newspaper. An interview, I love sharing this, an interview with a fellow Free Press staff member, Sue Embry, who would succeed Mori as editor of the Free Press in 1943. This quote, "I marveled because she was smoking and swearing. One time I heard her say to a guy, 'How come you didn't bring me a bottle of whiskey?' A Nisei woman who smoked and swore and drank whiskey. Most Nisei around her age, 22 or 23, were very conservative," end quote. And I found that in Diane Barr's book, The Unquiet Nisei, an oral history of the life of Sue Kunitomi Embry. What a dynamic quote. So then on December 5th, 1942, Fred Tayama, a prominent member of the JACL, was attacked and seriously injured in Manzanar, which led to Harry Ueno, a very vocal critic of the JACL, to be arrested, and a widespread center just uprising ensued and led to, I'm not sure how to describe this all, but chaos and violence and the police coming down onto the residents. And during that time period, for 20 whole days, the Free Press was completely shut down, which is kind of ironic given the name, the Free Press, with the publishing actually resuming on Christmas Day in 1942. So again, 20 days, it was blacked out and shut down completely. And once the newspaper was revived, there was absolutely no mention of the attack on Tayama, the arrests, or the military police shootings. Let's go to the next slide, please. Following this upheaval, staff members of the Free Press were threatened, and according to a 1946 project director's final report that I found, Mori was warned several times to quit her job. After every editorial, strongly pro-American Mori was receiving threatening letters and warnings, and Joe Blamey, a business manager of the Free Press, was also beaten up by a group of pro-Axis boys. So I'm just sharing a couple of quick photos of Manzanar Free Press staff at work. This is a great one, shot by Dorothea Lang in July 1942, and it's also in the Densho collection. I see people typing and people working on mimeograph machines. Next slide, please. I think this one also mimeographing machine, which is something a technology I haven't worked with, but I work with letterpresses all the time. It's very similar. It was a very time-consuming hand process. And next slide is, I think, a picture of our friend Joe, who interestingly, I loved this caption that I found with the photograph in the Bancroft, which Joe was born in Japan and came to the country when he was 7. And he also took turns as becoming the editor of the Manzanar Free Press at some point. And I'm sorry I didn't include the caption for the one on the right, where he's actually conferring with members of the Japanese language portion of the Free Press. So I didn't explain this, but the newspaper had an English section, and at a later point, a Japanese section was allowed to be published as well. So he's having a staff meeting there with other writers to discuss content, I'm sure. So Joe was very much aligned, I believe, with Chiye's politics. So he was kind of, as I explained in that quote, also beaten up and threatened by the politics that were, essentially destroying the camp at that point. So next slide. So Japanese to be evacuated with clearances OCR. I just think that this was an interesting piece of evidence that I found about people who they were saying that will be possibly moving on and leaving the center soon. And I could just see that by looking, Chiye was on the first section at the very bottom. There are a lot of these journalist types that are included in this, and it kind of points back to that quotation that I found about the Free Press staff kind of feeling threatened. Next slide, please. She was actually released from Manzanar on February 23rd, 1943. And this is an image of what we call the FAR, or the Final Accountability Reports, which are reports that show how people actually exited the camps, usually with the date, their names, their government numbers, or their family numbers, and where they were heading to. And again, this is always so interesting. So if you look under Chiye Mita at the first piece, you see Chiye Mita, but it also then says see Suzuki Jiro, and you look Jijiro, I'm sorry, and you look down to Suzuki Jijiro's his listing. You see her stepfather, her mom, and her mother. I'm sorry, her stepfather, her mom, and herself being released with a date, but really it's difficult for you to see here. But if you look, are able to blow this up, you can see all these different penciled in or pen marked surnames and different aliases that Chiye has, which honestly was kind of the final piece of the puzzle for me to start figuring out how she got in and how she left and what her names were while she was at Manzanar. So, and if you go to the very far column, it says destination of final departure. You see that she left for Chicago, Illinois. Her stepfather and her mother went to Tule Lake. I'm sorry to say that I did not follow up on that thread to see what happened with her stepfather and her mother. I just kept following Chiye's journey. So next slide, please. So and I also want to give a quick shout out to scholar Eric Muller for helping me crack that case on that last piece with the final accountability report. Chiye eventually went from Chicago to New York, where she met economist Harry T. Oshima, who she married in 1950. Oshima was at Columbia University obtaining his PhD, and the couple eventually had two sons, Neil and Evan Oshima. While she was in New York, she held the position of editor of a new publication called the Nisei Weekender, which was quote unquote for and of the Nisei New Yorker. It debuted in December 20, 1945 under the management of Nisei Press Associates, whose chairman was her husband. So both Mori and Oshima were very active members of the New York chapter of Nisei Progressives, which was the national political organization formed in 1947 to support Henry Wallace as a third-party U.S. presidential candidate for the Progressive Party. I wish I could have inserted a slide here for you guys of the Nisei Progressives, but for all the work that they've done, I have not found a good, clear, publicly accessible photograph. I see you, Brian. So I'm going to wrap this up quickly. Let's go to the next slide. Amazingly, in her post-war life, she invented herself yet again. So her husband's work as an economist took him all over the world with his family, and they moved many times. I was kind of lost her thread up till, I don't know, the time that she was living in about the Philippines, and then moved to Hawaii with her husband, where he passed away. But in that post-war lifetime, she became a successful artist and designer, specializing in jewelry and pottery design, batik, and wood, and was for a time a professor at the University of the Philippines. So the Chiye Mori Library, which was kind of a surprising thing to find, is actually in the Philippines and was founded by her son, Neil. Sadly, I did learn that she died in 1986 from that very first slide, May 15th in 2001 in Honolulu, Hawaii. But like I said, I was unable to find any online obituaries, and to date, I have never found a photograph of her.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I feel like it's just the beginning, that there's so much more to learn about her. I was in Hawaii at the time when she was there. I was like joking with Patricia, I could have run into her at Long's or something, but I mean, who knows? I also want to mention that Patricia also did a number of other biographical pieces for this round of the encyclopedia, including of the author of the artist, Louis Suzuki, and a couple of really interesting ones on two of the female JERS field workers, Mari Okazaki and Doris Hayashi, which I think are really interesting too. So anyway, thank you for that. I just want to also mention really quickly that one of the other contributors who did a lot of articles for this round was Greg Robinson, who Patricia alluded to, who teaches at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And many of you know of him. We were going to have him on this program also, but we're actually doing a separate program with Greg next month because of the release of his new book, The Unsung Great Stories of Extraordinary Japanese Americans, coming out of University of Washington Press. So look out for that program, and he'll talk about, I think, a number of people that are he also did encyclopedia articles as well for that. So anyway, another biographical piece was one that was done by Kristen, and I want to bring her on now to talk about another really interesting and undeservedly less known woman.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. I agree with Jonathan. You know, I refer to the Densho Encyclopedia constantly, so it's really, you know, a great opportunity to be able to contribute our own research to the encyclopedia. And it's fascinating to hear Patricia sort of talking about all that it takes to do research to write these articles. So I will talk to you about Chiyoko Sakamoto. So I think, like many of you, you know, I've just been marveling at the accomplishments of our vice president-elect, you know, and all the firsts that she has accomplished. And, you know, I know she has many identities, right? She's a woman, she's an Asian American woman. She's also an attorney from California. So I think it's so fitting that we talk about Chiyoko Sakamoto, who was the first Asian American woman to be admitted to the California State Bar, and that was in 1938. So in this photograph, you see Chiyoko on the right, her mother Kume is in the center, and then her older sister Tae is on the left. I think it's interesting to point out that Chiyoko was born in 1912 in the United States, whereas her older sister Tae was born in Japan and immigrated with her parents to the United States. And so I think this difference in nationality does play a role in the types of opportunities that, like, Chiyoko was afforded, for example. I picked this photograph because just a year prior to this, in 1925, Chiyoko's father, Hisamatsu Sakamoto, passed away. And Chiyoko talks about how that was sort of this impetus for her to take on more responsibility for the family, to support the family. And so she started working as a secretary while she was in high school, and then continued on as a legal aid for Katsuma Mukaeda, who was an Issei leader in Los Angeles. And he himself had gone to law school, but because he was a Japanese national, was not able to practice law officially. He did give legal advice. So Chiyoko started her career working as a legal aid for him. And I can only imagine that I think his struggles may have been like the impetus for her to want to go to law school. I'll point out that I learned about Chiyoko Sakamoto because of this collection that came into JANM in 2018. All the photographs that you'll see and artifacts are from the Sakamoto Sasano collection that Scott Yoshida donated. It's his family's collection in 2018. And I just was really taken by the way that the collection tells the Japanese American experience through the women of the Sakamoto Sasano family. And so Chiyoko is one of those family members. So next slide, please. So once Chiyoko finished college and she was working for Mukaeda, she decided to go to law school. And so she attended American University, which was formerly based in downtown Los Angeles. She enrolled in 1934. And at that time, she was the only woman, as well as the only person of color, to be a student at American University, earning a law degree. So, I mean, you can only imagine what her experience must have been like. In addition to being the only woman, person of color, she was also in the Honor Society at American University. And this is a pendant representing her involvement with the Honor Society. So next slide, please. And this is her law school class ring from American University. She finished in 1938, and that's also the same year that she was admitted to the California State Bar. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of Chiyoko Sakamoto. It said 1940s, so I assume this is probably earlier in 1940 when she opened her law practice in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo, in Mukaeda's office, actually. And at that time, she was practicing law that mostly dealt with business matters and leases. Let's see. And then shortly after, when her family was, forcibly moved from from Los Angeles, they were first sent to Santa Anita and then ultimately to Amachi. And it was at Amachi where she worked in the legal aid office, and mostly giving advice to incarcerees who had continuing business affairs on the West Coast, dealing with insurance, like those types of matters. But she did work in the legal aid office at Amachi. Next slide, please. Chiyoko met her husband Toru Takahashi at Amachi. They first resettled, I think in Ohio, and then came back to Los Angeles around 1947. And I think what's really interesting, and this is something that was quoted in her obituary, is that, I think she was really discouraged after she left Amachi and felt like she would never practice law again, partly because there was so much discrimination, and she felt, I think just unsure if she would continue in this career. And she was quoted as saying, "I was terribly disgusted. I thought I would never practice law again. It just didn't seem fair. There was a lot of prejudice against the Japanese and women. It was very depressing." So she comes back to Los Angeles around 1947, and employment was really difficult for returnees. But luckily, Hugh E Macbeth, who was well known for being a civil rights attorney and also being one of the few to stand up for Japanese Americans at the start of World War II, knew about Chiyoko, and he asked her to join his law firm. So here are some business cards that show that Sakamoto was part of the Sakamoto and Macbeth law office, which was based in Southwest Los Angeles, and they also had an office in downtown LA. After Hugh Macbeth's untimely death, Chiyoko opened up her own practice, again in Southwest Los Angeles. And so the business card on the right shows the address for her law practice. Next slide, please. This is a photograph from 1959. So, this is sort of at the peak of when she has her own practice, dealing a lot with family law matters. And let's see, next slide, please. And this is a photograph of Chiyoko sort of later in her law career in 1977. And this is around the time where she's involved with meetings that we're talking about establishing, like the Japanese American Bar Association and also the California Women Lawyers Association. So she was really integral into the founding of those two groups. And so shortly after that, she took over her husband's produce distribution company after he passed away. And so the early 80s is when she sort of ends her law practice. She takes over the produce distribution company for a little bit and then retires. And so for most of the rest of the 80s, she's traveling around the world, sort of enjoying her retirement before she passed away in 1994. But I think it's, it's really important to talk about Nisei women like Chiyoko Sakamoto. It's this lesser known story. And the reason why we're able to, to sort of piece together her life is because of this family collection that was donated to JANM. So I think, it speaks to like the importance of Densho's encyclopedia to get this information out, but also like collections at institutions like JANM and other, public institutions that are telling the Japanese American story. It's through these collections that we can sort of gain a better understanding of the Japanese American experience. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm just amazed that she's so little known, even among Japanese Americans. Was she not the first Asian American woman lawyer in California?
Yeah, I think in the United States. I mean, there's a Chinese American lawyer who is sort of touted as being like one of the first, but she was not admitted to the bar until after Chiyoko Sakamoto. And Chiyoko was the first and only Japanese American woman to practice law until post-World War II. So she is really, substantial.
Okay, and we're running a little long, so maybe just a few minutes on Winona. Basically, the other group of articles that we added were on kind of post-camp and legacy of the camps, including redress. And Kristen, this was kind of what she did her dissertation research on. I asked her to do a piece specifically on one of the trailer camps. It became kind of the main of the trailer camps that set up by the WRA and the Federal Public Housing Authority for returnees from the camps to Los Angeles, and that's Winona. If you could talk for a few minutes about Winona and share some of these, I think, really interesting images also.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so, January 2nd, 1945, that's when the formerly exclusionary zone on the West Coast is reopened to Japanese Americans. And for that first year, there aren't too many returnees who voluntarily come back to Los Angeles. There are also quite a few people who are still in what we call America's concentration camps. In 1945, probably early on in 1945, there are about 70,000 people that are still in camp. And the War Relocation Authority, it was not intended to be a permanent agency. They were going to dissolve soon. So they're wondering what to do with all of the remaining people in camp before the agency dissolves. And so the original intent of the relocation centers was to widely disperse the population across the country, but they end up going against their objective and deciding that they're going to send all the remaining people in camp back to their point of origin, which for most people was Los Angeles or Southern California. They also realized that because there's such an acute housing shortage in Los Angeles, that they're going to have to provide temporary housing. And they emphasize that this will be temporary. And so they appealed to the War Department for temporary housing, trailers and barracks to set up throughout Southern California. So there were at least 7 camps across Southern California. Winona is one of them. If you've ever been to the Burbank airport, the long-term parking lot is basically the site of where Winona was. So in November 45, that's when the first residents start to arrive at Winona. So here you see lots of trailers and barracks. And so all of the residents had to prove that they had been looking for housing but could not find housing. They had to pay rent each month for the trailer or barracks that they lived in. And they also had to pay for meals, which is not, something that they had to pay during World War II. So for people who have nothing, it's really difficult to come up with, the money to pay for, rent and meals. Next slide, please. So part of the deal is that they are supposed to be looking for employment as well as permanent housing. So I imagine that there were like bulletin boards like you see in this photograph that show different employment and housing opportunities, although these are really scarce. And that's why a lot of the residents remained in these trailer installations because they had no other options. All these photographs come from the War Relocation Authority's collection at the Bancroft Library. And WRA photographers took all the photographs that you see here in November of 45. So when Winona first starts to open. You can advance the slide, please. Thank you. So, this shows some of the barracks at Winona. And from the very start, when former incarcerees arrived, they commented on how poor the facilities were. There were power shortages constantly. There was very little medical aid that they had access to. In terms of facilities, like they had very little space for their belongings or just even space to sort of, live in. And so while the WRA said this was going to be a very temporary situation, they realized that they would have to create more long-term facilities. So they decide that they're going to use Winona as a more substantial or long-term facility. They're going to make updates. So in order to do that, they have to shuffle people around. They decide they're going to consolidate all the Japanese Americans in these other trailer installations. And in order to do that, they move people around unnecessarily, it seemed, just so they could empty Winona for a while, upgrade it, and then bring all the Japanese Americans living in these trailer installations to Winona. So at the end of March, they close Winona, and by May, they bring people back. And Winona was not ready to receive all these, people in May of 1946. And so there's a lot of talk about how the facilities were inadequate. The toilet facilities were inadequate. The kitchen facilities were as well. And they were still having problems with issues like electricity. And so, it just shows like that this is the most vulnerable population of people returning, and that they just had to constantly endure all of these upheavals and inadequate, facilities seems really unfair and shows that the government really left them behind. Next slide, please. So the majority of the population at Winona and these other trailer installations were a lot of children. So it was a lot of young families who had children and also elderly residents. So next slide. So you see, like, there were a lot of Issei bachelors who never married, who had trouble finding employment, didn't have families that they could depend on. So actually, before Winona reopens in May, they decide to send 250 Issei bachelors to Rancho Los Amigos, which was a county healthcare facility where they lived out the rest of their lives. So again, the most vulnerable population are at the trailer installations like Winona. Next slide, please. This one I thought was, poignant. They all are, all these photographs are, but, showing, trying to make home once again in a very temporary situation. So let's see. In 1947, the owner of the property, which was like an aerospace company, decides that they're going to use the property for manufacturing. And so the Federal Public Housing Authority, which was overseeing Winona, was forced to close. So what do you do with the remaining families? There were these two Nisei who had a trailer. They leased land to have like a trailer park in a nearby property called Doreen sometimes it's called Roscoe or Sun Valley, but it was a place for families who were formerly in Winona who purchased the trailers. They could come and live in this trailer camp called Doreen. And that was from November 1947, and that stayed open until 1956. Next slide, please. This is a photograph that I found actually yesterday at Janum. This is a photograph that was part of a scrapbook that Estelle Ishigo kept. So I believe that's her handwriting at the bottom. I've been looking, I need to spend more time with this. It's really interesting. There are letters, there are also photographs where Estelle Ishigo's dates are really interesting. It seems like she's moving constantly from like Burbank to Lomita to Harbor City to Hawthorne. And so I need to sort of understand the timeline, but it shows that there's this constant upheaval. I'm showing this photograph because I'm not quite sure if the Ishigos were at Winona or at Magnolia. So I'm hoping that by showing this photograph to a large audience, there are people who might recognize some of these children in the photographs and can help us identify who some of these children are and verify that this was Winona or Magnolia in March 1946. So.
Yeah, so if anybody has, any clues, you can contact us or Kristen at Janum. So anyway, we're almost out of time, but we have just a couple minutes, and there are some interesting questions, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. Maybe an easy one. One question for Kristen. Some of the Buddhist temples provided shelter for the evacuees who did not have jobs or couldn't rent, ?
Yes, there were quite a few hostels, some operated by, Buddhist temples, some operated by private, proprietors, but yes, and then the American Friends, quite a few hostels all across Southern California that also provided temporary housing.
Okay. And then Greg Robinson also sent a message. Elizabeth Ohi, later Elizabeth Owens, a biracial Nisei in Chicago, was admitted to the bar in 1937, 1 year before Sakamoto, but did not practice. She ended up working for the federal government. So just another point of information there. Another question, I think this would be more for Jonathan. One problem I've encountered in teaching this history at the UW to undergraduates is that students will say, I'm happy to learn that American concentration camps were so much nicer, so different from European ones. Look, they could do chemistry and they had schools, etc. Does the theory of scientific patriotism offer a useful counter-narrative to my undergrad struggling with American imperial legacies?
That's a good question. I would say yes and no in some ways. I'll start with the yes. What I didn't clarify during my presentation, what I want to emphasize with scientific patriotism was ways in which Japanese American scientists supported the war efforts in different ways than our conventional understanding, whether it was working with the camouflage nets or enlisting in the US military. So the Waiuli project had a very, there was a purpose that was to serve the war effort and providing a new form of rubber for the US military. So that was in part of how, not just in a very different sort of way, that Japanese Americans participated in supporting the war effort. This is a kind of, the way I would say no is because that's a broader discussion of comparing the camps, the concentration camps of the United States to those in Europe, which is kind of it's been the center of a number of historical debates, of course, of the importance or the purpose of doing those comparisons. And sometimes what it's used is to kind of belittle what actually happens in America's concentration camps, is that, yes, there were different forms of concentration camps. What happens at Manzanar is not the same as what happened with the Nazi concentration camps, but it doesn't minimize the extent to which there was suffering, or there were ways in which the camps caused health problems. One topic I've been interested in particular is with public health, and the extreme limitations of public health in the camps. Although there were hospitals, even dental offices, the materials that were available were pretty far and few between. And that was in part because of the limits of supplies. And so that, I think, underscores the extent to which it was not as extreme as these other cases, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there was suffering. And of course, there were deaths, like the Wakasa shooting at Topaz. So things to keep in mind. I wouldn't use that term necessarily as to help with the overall argument, but I think it's part of what you could use to describe it. So,
okay, thanks, Jonathan. For a quick one for Patricia, how old was Chiye when she was separated from her parents? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. I was going to say that she really wasn't separated from them until she was an adult, since they were in Manzanar together and they actually exited at the same time. If that was like 1943 and she was born in 1915, she was in her late 20s maybe. So she wasn't a child. She was definitely an adult at that point, and they went separate ways. And I do want to follow up on what happened to her parents. It would be very interesting to see what happened.
Okay. And maybe one more, since we're already past time, but and this would be more for Kristen, but sorry if you already covered this, but when the Japanese Americans first arrived at the Winona camp and other similar temporary housing camps, did they have a sense of how long they'd be permitted to stay? And related, are those locations, i.e. the long-term parking lot at the Burbank airport, marked or memorialized in any way?
Yeah, great questions. When they first arrived, so in November of 45, I mean, Dylan Meyer, who was head of the WRA, was saying this is very temporary, and all of the residents in these installations should find permanent housing by March 1st, which had to have been a very, unrealistic deadline that was just a few months away. And that was around the time the WRA was going to dissolve, and that's why I think he set that date. But as they realized that was like an unrealistic deadline, they kept extending it. But that had to cause a lot of anxiety for the residents, not knowing when, these camps would actually close. I don't think that site is memorialized or marked in any way, and it sounds like a really good public history project for us to explore further.
Yeah, and I hope someday that you will do pieces on like the other trailer parks, and maybe someday we'll add the hostels and so forth, because that whole story is largely untold until you write your book. So anyway, there are some other questions we'll try to answer privately, but we're about out of time, so we'll let everybody go back to lunch. And thank you everyone for joining us. Look for these articles online or coming up in the next few weeks. They should all be online by the end of the year. Thank you again, and hope you join us for future programs of this kind.